Again, I want to thank Ian for that wonderful introduction. I think he Googled the wrong Ken Barnes, but that's okay. I want to thank Latrobe. Ken, really wonderful what you folks are doing, and so gracious of you to have us here. And of course, I have my bosses here from Ridley, in addition to the members of the board. We have Brian Rosner, our principal, and we have Tim, who's our dean of academics, and they're the gentlemen who made the decision to bring me on board, so I'm very, very thankful for that. And Kara Martin, who you'll hear from later, she's the associate dean. Kara, thank you for all the work that you do every single day, especially when I'm back in Oxford doing things there. And then so many people who made tonight possible. I really can't thank you enough, Wayne and James and Sally, and you know who you are. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. I want to start, if I may, with two stories. The first story is about the investment banker and the Pope who died on the same day. Now, they went to heaven, and they got to the pearly gates, and two cars pulled up. One was a Volkswagen, one was a stretch limousine. So the Pope went to get in the stretch limousine, and St. Peter said, no, no, and he waved over to the investment banker, and the investment banker got the stretch limousine. The Pope had to ride in the Volkswagen. So they got to the neighborhood that they were going to live in, and there were two empty houses. One was a mansion, the other was a two-bedroom semi-detached. So the Pope went to go into the mansion, and St. Peter said, no, 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 no. The investment banker got the mansion, and the Pope got the two-bedroom semi-detached. Well, that night there was a banquet, and there were two empty seats, one right next to the Lord, one at the end of the table, and the Pope thought, now's the payoff. He went to sit next to the Lord. St. Peter said, no, 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 no. And he waved over, and the investment banker got the seat next to the Lord, and the Pope said, wait a minute, time out. What's going on here? I'm the Pope. He's an investment banker. St. Peter said, yeah, I got 100 popes. He's the first investment banker.
That'll be right.
I want to tell you another true story. Could be, don't know. I'm going to talk tonight quite a lot about the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And I'm going to talk about decisions that were made that I believe were immoral decisions. Now, early in my career in New York City, I was still in my early 30s, I was doing business with Lehman Brothers. Back then it was Shearson Lehman Brothers. It was later spun off. And I was playing golf with the number 2 man in the organization, the COO of Shearson Lehman Brothers. And I was punching way above my weight. I was a very young, snot-nosed executive. I was the type of guy who used to wear the yellow ties and the suspenders. It was really awful. So we were out playing golf, and he was my guest, and we had never golfed before, and I didn't realize how lousy he was at golf. And I actually broke par that day, and he all of a sudden wanted to be my BFF. You know, this is amazing. He wanted to have a scratch golfer as his best friend, even though I was not in his league. You know, he was one of the most successful men on Wall Street. I was just this up-and-coming, snot-nosed kid. But there were 2 lessons I learned that day. The first lesson is, golf is the great equalizer. So for those of you who haven't yet taken up the game, it's worth it. Because if you can get your game down to scratch, you can play with anybody. But the second is this. The people I'm going to talk about tonight, and the people who run these businesses, and the people who make these decisions, they don't have horns. They're ordinary people. Some of them are really nice people. They're just like you. They're just like me. But they're also capable of making extraordinarily immoral decisions. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. But before we start, I want to share with you a verse from Scripture that my friend Peter Kentley gave me the other day. Proverbs 21:22. A wise man scales the city of the mighty and brings down the trusted stronghold. I don't want to bring down capitalism, but I do want to scale the walls of capitalism and bring down postmodern capitalism, which we'll talk about later. So I want to start with a simple premise, and that premise is that capitalism works. Simple as that. It works for a wide variety of reasons, but one of the reasons why capitalism works is that it is not an artificial construct that was created by economists, which is then enforced by governments from the top down. That's not what capitalism is. Capitalism, in fact, is a subject, not an object. It has no will behind it. It is a process that we observe. And it is the evolutionary process of trade which over the centuries incorporated methods which are extremely efficient in creating wealth. So capitalism works. But just like with biological evolution, it has no moral compass of its own. In fact, capitalism can be capricious, it can be brutal, it can be manipulated by a few at the expense of the many. And as we learned in the global financial crisis, it is far from infallible. So the question becomes for me as a person of faith, what are Christians supposed to do with capitalism? What do we do with it? How do we respond to it? Now, there are some people who take a utopian view, and they have said, let's just throw capitalism out the door. Let's create a new economic construct built on biblical principles, and that's what we'll do. Well, here's the problem with that thinking. First of all, we aren't clever enough to do it. Not even at Oxford. And these guys are from Cambridge, actually, the utopians I'm talking about, so that's even worse. We aren't clever enough to do it. The system has become so complex, no one could possibly create the perfect economic system that would replace the system we have. The second is, I believe it's based on a false premise. And that is the premise that Christians are called to change the world. I don't believe we are. I don't believe Jesus came to change the world. In fact, I can give you lots of examples where Jesus accepted the world exactly as he found it. That doesn't mean he approved of it. The poor you will always have with you. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. But Jesus did come to redeem the world. And a redeemed world will be changed. But if you start with the premise that Christians are supposed to change the world, you end up starting with the ends and ignore the means. And it's in the means that we find our souls. So, the problem we have with capitalism is not just structural, I believe it is also moral. And the global financial crisis revealed starkly the problems inherent in the current system. Warren Buffett famously said, you don't know who's swimming naked until the tide goes out. It turns out that there was an awful lot of economic skinny dipping going on. Because in fact, in September of 2008, there was such a shockwave sent through the world's economic systems that no one knew if it was a blip or economic Armageddon. And the fact of the matter is, we still don't know. I had coffee with one of the most eminent economists in the world the last time I was back in Oxford, and he looked at me and he said, Ken, I got to be honest with you, I don't know where this thing's going. That's the fact. We still don't know where this thing is going. It's a hugely important problem that has to be solved. But like with most of these things, the blue touch paper was the failure of a single organization, Lehman Brothers. Let's talk about the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers, before June of 2008, was the fourth largest investment bank in the world, 28,000 employees, $700 billion of assets under management, and the CEO, Dick Fuld, known affectionately as the gorilla, he was one of the most powerful and feared men on Wall Street. Why? Because he had reported 55 consecutive quarters of profit. He was a giant on Wall Street. Yet within 3 months of June of 2008, the company was bankrupt. Now, a lot of people ask the questions, how is that possible? What made it happen? I'll talk about some of those things tonight. But the question I'm really interested in is why? Why did it happen? What were the motives that drove the decisions that people made? What was it about the culture of Lehman Brothers that created this monster that when it died, it brought almost the entire global financial system to its knees? And the answer can be found in 3 words: debt, deception, and derivatives. Those are the 3 things that define what happened. I'm going to start with derivatives. Now, here's the thing about derivatives. There's an awful lot written about derivatives. There's an awful lot of people that throw derivatives under the bus. The fact of the matter is, they've been around for 25 years at least. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with a derivative as a product. But for those of you who don't know, a derivative is not an asset in and of itself. It is a product that promises cash payments based on the performance of an asset pool. It derives its value from the value of the assets in the portfolio. Basically, the cash flow of those assets. So these are payment contracts. Okay? Now, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. As long as these things are constructed well, they can be a very good vehicle for people to make very, very good return on investment. But there is a particularly strange version of these, which is a relatively recent phenomenon, and that is the collateralized debt obligation, the CDO. And it's the CDOs that cause the problem. A collateralized debt obligation is a derivative which is built on other people's debts. So in other words, banks take the loans that they have and they sell those loans on, and the people who buy those loans derive benefit from the payment on the principal and the interest. So a CDO is a promise to pay a return based on the promises of the people who took out loans to pay back the loans. Simple enough, right? Well, it would be okay, assuming that the underlying assets themselves are properly secured, and assuming that the people who have promised to pay back these loans are credit worthy. But here's what happened. In the late 90s, in fact, for virtually all of the 90s and a good part of the early 2000s, America had a wonderful economic season. And America had a lot of inward investment, mostly coming from China. So the American system was flush with cash. And what happens when you have an economic system that's flush with cash? It needs to chase assets because cash can't sit dormant. But there weren't enough assets out there, so assets had to be invented. So that meant there was a big demand for more of these CDOs. But in order to have CDOs, you got to create more debt instruments. Well, what's the safest place? Traditionally, real estate. So there was so much demand for mortgages in America during this period from 2002 to 2006 that subprime mortgages, as they're called, went from 7.4% of the market to 23.7% of the market, and there were $2.5 trillion of subprime mortgages coming into the market. Now, what is a subprime mortgage? It's a mortgage whose value is a little bit suspect. Why? Well, because the mortgages are being given to people with no income, no job, and no assets. A ninja mortgage. I kid you not. I did not make this up. Ninja mortgages. No income, no job, no assets. Okay? And it gets worse. They don't have to put any money down. Why? Because real estate prices go up. Equity schmequity. Who needs equity? We're going to give these people loans. Credit ratings? We're not going to check their credit ratings. Why? Because these people who were making these debt instruments weren't keeping the debts on their books. They were selling them off to the CDOs. So if you're the person who says, I'm going to give you a mortgage, And I don't care if you can't pay it back, because you know what? I'm going to dump it on somebody else. And there was $2.5 trillion of these subprime mortgages floating around the market. Now, when you've got a situation like that, I think it's fair to say it's not sustainable. Also, you had a situation where the derivatives, instead of mitigating the risk by spreading it, actually ended up contaminating good loans with the bad loans. And so when the bottom fell out and people woke up one day and they found out that in fact these loans are bad, or in the case of the person who took out the loan, my house isn't worth what I owe on it, they just defaulted. They just defaulted in a massive scale. So I'm going to have to, unfortunately, throw a stone at economics. I apologize, Ian, it's nothing personal. But here's one of the problems with economics. Economics likes to think of itself as a predictive science. It's not. At best, it is an indicative science, because we can never be really positive how human beings will act in a certain situation. It's very hard to predict what people are actually going to do. And the computer models that supported the CDOs, by the way, assumed at least a 50% increase in defaults. The normal default rate was 2%. They said, let's assume 3%. They didn't assume 29%. And so the whole thing came down like a house of cards. Now look, this happened before Lehman Brothers, and that's why I'm bringing it to your attention. Because when the subprime mortgage crisis happened, virtually everybody in the industry got out of it. Except one, Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers decided that they were going to take a counter-cyclical strategy. And Lehman Brothers went heavy into CDOs. And they went heavy into CDOs because no one else was doing it. And they thought, here's a niche in the market that no one's covering. So they took money, big amounts of money, and they bought up lots and lots and lots of CDOs. Now, that's one problem. The second problem is its overall business model was bad. It had a huge debt burden as a company compared to its assets. Okay? It was carrying $25 billion in assets. It was managing $700 billion in long-term assets and another $700 billion in short-term liabilities. That's not a good thing, because that means you have to go to the repo market every day and borrow $200 billion a day just to cover your cash margins. What's $200 billion among friends? But guess what happened? The people in the repo market said, wait a minute. The collateral you're putting up for these repo loans are based on CDOs. Everybody else on the street got out of CDOs. Why should we lend you $200 billion a day so that you can stay in this dodgy business? Now there was a real problem, because then they had to find a way to come up with cash. That meant they had to cook the books, frankly. And what's shocking is they cooked the books legally. That's right, they cooked the books legally. Here's the deception that they pulled, and some of you are glazing over. I know this is very economic. I promise we'll get to the ethics part soon, but you got to understand what happened here. Here's how they cooked the books. There's an accounting trick called Repo 105, which technically allows companies that go into the repo market to take those assets off the balance sheet as if they had actually sold them. And they only did Repo 105 at the end of every reporting period. So when they went to the street with their results, they could pretend they weren't as heavily leveraged as they were, because they pretended that their repo, which is normally just a daily loan, was actually a sale, so they took those assets off the books. They were invisible just long enough for them to report that they had a very different leverage than they really did. Then they took the liquidity pool, which was $45 billion on paper, but they didn't tell people most of it was already pledged to other loans. So it was a fake liquidity pool. And they went to the market and they raised $6 billion in a new public offering, even though they had cooked the books. Well, guess what? It didn't work. It didn't work, and they woke up one day on the 14th of September, 2008, to find that nobody wanted to play with them anymore, and they couldn't sell the business over the weekend. And on the 15th of September, 2008, they went bust. Now, how does that happen? Why did that happen? We look back and we think, this is crazy. Well, here's why. They were doing exactly what they were taught to do in business school. They were doing what everybody did, which was they followed the Friedman doctrine. Milt Friedman, brilliant Nobel Prize winning economist. I'm not throwing the entire doctrine under the bus, but he wrote a very famous article in September of 1970. And in that article, in the New York Times Magazine, Milt Friedman said this. He said that the ultimate moral responsibility of an executive is to make as much money as possible within the constraints of law and local custom. That's it. That's it, carte blanche. Well, here's the problem with the Friedman doctrine. The Friedman doctrine doesn't take time into account. Make as much money as possible when? Tomorrow? The next day? A month later? A year later? Over 5 years? How can you say that's your moral responsibility when you're not talking about time? The second thing is, I just gave you an example of a perfectly legal activity which is perfectly immoral, which is to manipulate loopholes in the accounting standards in order to present a picture of health that is fundamentally different than reality. Perfectly legal, not responsible, and not moral. And lastly, we no longer live in a culture that has a commonly accepted view of right and wrong. That's why I say, because the Friedman doctrine has failed us, we have a moral crisis more than we have a structural crisis. And here is how I'm defining moral failure. Any decision or act made by any executive or company which violates the principles of virtue as defined by Thomas Aquinas in his seminal work, Summa Theologica. That is the stake I'm putting in the ground. I'm saying that these virtues of prudence and justice and courage and temperance, those virtues should be the moral standard that we follow. And the reason why I say we should follow them is because, first of all, even Aquinas would say that they aren't uniquely Christian. They are, in fact, what Calvin would call part of common grace. We are all capable, regardless of religious affiliation or no religious affiliation, we are capable of following these virtues. And the only thing that's required to really understand virtue ethics is the exercise of your own conscience. You don't have to get, involved in ethics deeply to understand it. So the first one of prudence, do you know how Aquinas defines prudence? He defines prudence as knowing what to want and what not to want. How sublime is that? Because that ties together virtue with motive. And it insists merely that we understand what we should value. And virtually every philosopher, secular or religious, for the last 1,000 years, has said what we're supposed to want is the common good. What we saw at Lehman Brothers wasn't prudence. What we saw at Lehman Brothers was recklessness. Justice. Justice is doing that which is fair to everyone. That's justice. And under justice, Aquinas also gives us a subordinate virtue of truthfulness. Because you can't have economic activity without truthfulness. We didn't have equity in Lehman Brothers. We had some people making $50 million a year in salaries, while other people lost their pension funds. That's not equitable. And we didn't have truth-telling. We had people who were cooking the books in order to keep their own ship afloat. And then the next one is courage. Courage is extremely important to the formula because courage is what allows people to make decisions that may or may not be in their immediate self-interest. Okay? And here's one of the problems. As a culture, we don't value courage. We don't. When our politicians make tough decisions, we say they're weak. We say they're flip-flopping. We say they don't have a backbone. Someone was just telling me the other day that they were in the state of Missouri in America, and they went to the Truman House, and they saw the Truman Library. President Truman was probably the most unpopular president in U.S. history, but he made the toughest decisions. He used to have a thing on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." That's real virtue, ethics at work. And it would have taken a lot of courage for Dick Fuld to say to his shareholders, "I'm sorry, but we're going to cut our losses. We're not going to continue with this counter-cyclical strategy. We're not going to drive the gravy train over a cliff." But they didn't have the courage to do that. Aquinas says courage. And what's the opposite? Fear. Fear. And lastly, temperance. And here's the thing about temperance. Let me tell you something about Thomas Aquinas. Any Aquinas scholars here? Oh, you've written a little on, okay. Aquinas was a monk, but he wasn't a prude. Okay? Aquinas was a monk, but he wasn't a prude. He was not afraid of pleasure. He saw pleasure as a gift from God. Okay? He used to refer to people who wouldn't laugh at a joke or have a glass of wine as wet blankets. Okay? He was not a Puritan. But he believed very, very strongly in temperance. Why? Because pleasure is hardwired into our DNA. Pleasure is something that God has given us as part of what it means to be human. So our sexual pleasure helps us procreate and keep the species going. It's hardwired into our DNA, but we need to be temperate when it comes to our sexual pleasure. Our taste buds, things taste good. It gives us pleasure. If it wasn't for that, most of us would be anorexic and probably be malnutritioned and die. But he says, even though you have these taste buds, you need to be temperate. And with temperance comes a whole lot of other sub-virtues, including humility. Because at the end of the day, folks, it was hubris that brought down Lehman Brothers. It was hubris. And the other side of humility, Aquinas says that humility leads to a host of other sins, the worst one being greed. Greed. The other thing that brought down Lehman Brothers was greed. And the reason why greed is such an awful sin is because greed is idolatry. The Apostle Paul tells us that. Brian wrote a book with that title. Greed is idolatry. Why? Because when we are greedy, we set up idols that compete with God. And we then put all of our energies, all of our wealth, all of our time, all of our talent, everything into feeding that greed. And here's the problem. The problem is Wall Street is built on greed. Wall Street is built on greed, and this is the problem. It depends on greed. It encourages greed. We don't have a capitalism that Adam Smith would recognize. We don't have a capitalism that Max Weber would recognize. What we have is post-modern capitalism. And here's how I define post-modern capitalism. It is capitalism that is devoid of a moral compass and resistant, if not impervious, to ethical constraint. That is postmodern capitalism. It is capitalism that is simply a reflection of the culture around us. Remember, there is no will behind capitalism. Capitalism is an ever-evolving phenomenon, and it will reflect the culture around it. So because we live in a culture that has no moral standards, we have postmodern capitalism. So how are we going to overcome postmodern capitalism? Well, there are a lot of different things we can do to try to overcome postmodern capitalism. Some people think regulation. Sorry, got bad news for you. It's not going to work. Regulation is important. We need regulation, but if history has taught us anything, history has taught us that the crooks are one step ahead of the regulators at all times. So regulation isn't going to cut it. Okay? Some people think virtuous business decision making. If we would just train senior executives in the virtues, that would do it. Good step in the right direction, still not enough. Why? Because the nature of business is changing. Technology has changed the way organizations operate, and now you have people across organizations making decisions that affect everyone. So you can't just rely on a handful of people at the top of the pyramid, because the pyramid doesn't exist anymore. Pyramid's gone. When Barclays Bank was just fined almost $1 billion, it was because of decisions that were made 3 levels below the board that the board never even knew about. So it can't just be executive decision making. It has to be culture. And what are the 3 rudimentary building blocks of culture? Common values, common language, and a shared history. So very simply, I would propose this to you, to Gen Y coming up, because they're the people going to have to make this happen, to the church, to the business community, to our politicians. Here's what I would recommend. I would recommend that businesses adopt as their corporate values the cardinal virtues given to us by Thomas Aquinas. And by the way, they predate Aquinas. They're Aristotelian, okay? And Augustine adopted them, and Gregory the Great adopted them. And okay, we've been the guardians. The church has been the guardians of these virtues, but they predate Christianity. Imagine that. Because a lot of companies, every company has its value statement, right? Have you ever read the value statement of most companies? They're at best teleological, okay? They say things like, our value is to treat customers like they're the most important people in the world. Well, that's not really a value. That's not something I want to get out of bed of and say, oh, I work for a company that treats its customers like they're the only people in the world. It's not a value, okay? Values have to be more than that. Values have to be intrinsic to what it means to be human. You know, when the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson, it starts with a faith statement. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And then it goes on to say, all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. What are they? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those are values. Those are things people can get excited about. Now, I know you guys haven't had a Declaration of Independence, but you got time. Actually, considering some of our presidents, you did the right thing. Imagine if companies adopted prudence and justice and courage and temperance as their corporate values. And then imagine if they created a language around it, if they created a vocabulary around it. Everyone who's ever worked for a big company, you know what I'm talking about, right? Every company has its own vocabulary. Okay? And it's usually a bunch of acronyms. They drive me nuts. But, you know, that's the way it is. I had a friend who worked for IBM. They never said a sentence with a full word in it. It was just acronym after acronym after acronym. And if you're interested in things like efficiency, then it's 5S, 6 Sigma, Kaizen, right? That's part of your language. That's part of your vocabulary. If you're interested in customer service, you know, it's things like CSI and CRM and on and on. And if you're interested just in money, then it's EBITDA and COS and ROIS. You all know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, so imagine if people adopted a language that supported these virtues. And there are two types of corporate language. The first is the lingua franca of the business itself, the internal stuff. But the second is more important, and that's the corporate messaging. That's the language you bring out into the marketplace, because that language is what informs your own people as well as the market, the kind of company you are. IBM, famously, what's their motto? Think. That's IBM's motto. Why? It reflects what they value, the notion that the computer is an extension of your mind. Apple Computer, what's theirs? Think differently. Why? Because Steve Jobs didn't want to be IBM, and he actually thought the computer was an extension of the self. So their corporate language supported and informed the kind of company they are. It's the same with Tesco's and Walmart. Their corporate mottos are save money. Every little helps. Because they think that's important. And it reflects the kind of company they are. Imagine if you had corporations that created a language around these virtues. Imagine if you had a corporate culture who used terms like always do the right thing, seek the common good. What's good for everyone is good for us, as opposed to the reverse. Think about that. It would change the way people think about their work every single day, because corporate culture really does impact how people view their life at work. That I can promise you. There's a lot of research on that. Corporate culture impacts how people think about their life at work. Some of you may have just seen in the paper this week, Ryanair is changing or trying to change its corporate culture because the corporate culture reflects Tim O'Leary. And they've decided it's bad for the business. So they want to now be the kinder, gentler, nicer Ryanair. Because this stuff is real. Now I know Google has a new corporate motto that says, don't be evil. That's not exactly what I'm thinking about, but hey, it's a step in the right direction. And lastly, with all the best intention in the world, even if you have these virtues as the values of the company, even if you nail them to the mast, even if you create a vocabulary and a language that everybody speaks, at the end of the day, you will only create virtuous business cultures if the people in those companies act in virtuous ways. So you can't just talk the talk. You've got to walk the walk. You have to be willing as a company to be prudent. And that doesn't just mean to be careful. It means to know what to want and what not to want, and to seek the common good. You have to be a company that believes in justice and accepts the fact that every corporate decision that's ever been made affects people outside the business. Every corporate decision that has ever been made affects people outside the business. And companies that are courageous, spiritually, morally, ethically courageous. And the definition of courage Aquinas gives us is brilliant. And that is to oppose anything that violates the precepts of virtue themselves. Isn't that a brilliant definition of courage? And that's the one Aquinas gives us. And lastly, temperance. There's an old expression on Wall Street. And here's what it is. I remember it like it was yesterday when I was told this by an old codger when I first went to New York. He said, bulls make money, bears make money, pigs get slaughtered. They have forgotten their own old saying. Because the pigs, sadly, have been running the show for quite a while. So I believe the time is right, because if you see what's going on in the corporate world right now, where people are talking about not just corporate governance, they're talking about a slew of other things. They're talking about multiple bottom line. They're talking about tax avoidance. They're talking about social responsibility. They're talking about stakeholders instead of just shareholders. There is a mood that is permeating the corporate world today people want to adopt these virtues because they know that postmodern capitalism is a very dangerous thing. And the only antidote, in my humble opinion, is for us to create, sustain, and empower people to have virtuous business cultures from top to bottom. Thank you.